Good afternoon. I am going to begin one of our first poetry lessons. And through our study of Traveling Through the Dark today, I'm going to introduce to you one of the primary ways by which we dive into our own writing. And that is by exposing ourselves to work within a particular genre in which we are about to write. And so we're going to read a poem called Traveling Through the Dark by William Stafford. And what I want you to think about is sort of shifting your lens a little bit, because you guys have primarily, if ever, encountered poetry within the last couple of years in the setting of doing literary analysis in an English class. Or possibly by some stretch of my imagination, I can think that some of you have probably done this. You have maybe read poetry for pleasure. And the reason why I can say that is partially because if you listen to music and you like song lyrics, that in itself is an example of poetry that is written to entertain us. And so if your stereotypes of poetry might possibly be somewhat negative, or if you think of it as something kind of daunting, I'm going to give you permission to completely set aside all of the anxiety of doing literary analysis. And I want you to just encounter the poem that we're going to look at today as a work of art and respond to it more from the gut and personally just take it in. And then the other aspect of it, because I know we did that already a little bit with reading the beautiful poem Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins, which really asks us not to tie any poem to a chair and try to beat it with a hose and get some sort of clear answer of what it really means. There is no answer to what the poem really means. The poem means what it means in the moment in which you encounter it. In fact, there's an entire school of literary thought, which is called reader response theory, which says that you can never even read the same work twice because you are going to be different the next time that you encounter it. And so you're going to encounter this poem today as the person that you are today in the particular circumstances that you are in today. And it will have meaning to you based on all of those factors. You can't make a poem mean anything you want it to mean. We're bound by the words that the poet gives us. However, other than that, how it strikes us is really up to us. The other thing is that I want you to switch from that lens of being a reader or someone doing literary analysis, or even switch from the lens of being entertained. Because today, as we encounter this poem, we are reading as writers. And when you read as a writer, you're looking more at the choices that the writer has made in order to create that experience that you are having of the piece of writing. And you're being inspired and you're seeing what is possible within the specific genre in which you are reading. So let's go ahead and progress today as writers and reading poetry as someone who is going to write poetry. So we're looking at the power of narrative poetry today. And narrative simply means the telling of a story. So we have a couple of essential questions, and I really want you to think about each of them independently for a second. I'm going to read them to you, and then you're going to give them a little bit of thought. The first is, how can the elements of story transfer to the genre of poetry? We're pretty familiar with storytelling. We tell stories in our everyday lives, and we encounter stories constantly through all different forms of media. It is not then surprising that since we are a race of people who tell stories and love stories and entertain ourselves with stories, that in the genre of poetry, storytelling might be a powerful tool for us. So that's our first essential question. The second one is, how can memory serve as a resource for creating art? And in this case, I'm saying memory because I don't want you to be limited to only experiences that you're having right now. I want you to realize that you have lived many stories, that each one of the stories that you have lived, every experience you've had, every encounter on the side of the road, every time you've been with another human being, every tragic, joyful, horrible, wonderful thing that has ever happened to you has the potential to become the material, the raw material for you to make a poem out of. And we can tell stories through poetry. So how can memory serve as a resource? Everything you have ever lived could become a poem. All right, the next one is, how can being present in the sensory experience of life transform an artist's life? So, in a couple of minutes, when you're finished with this lesson right here, I also want you to watch a little video that I've linked separately, in which William Stafford actually tells the story of where this poem came from. And I love how he was so present in the moment of his life, in the sounds and the smells and the sensory experience, the tactile experience of his life, that he just went home and made a poem out of something that happened to him. And when you slow down a little bit, which is something that all of us have had to do quite a bit in these last couple of days, and you really take in every moment, wow, the daily small details of life are material for poetry. And every minute and every second of every day, we have thousands of sensory experiences. We're always tasting, we're always smelling, we're always hearing, we're always feeling, we're always seeing. All of these sensory experiences are going on constantly. We filter them. And we filter them because we can't focus on everything all at once. We get really stressed out when we're not filtering well. But what's amazing is that when you key into the sensory experiences, and you're really alive in a moment, you tend to remember it much more. And that can become a poem. And so I want you to think about that and how that happened for William Stafford and how it can happen for you. Because as you are journaling, you can go back in your mind and in your memory to an experience that you have had and start translating that into a potential poem. All right. So, in just a second after I go through these different prompts, what I want you to do is pause this video. And I want you to get out your journal and spend about 5 to 10 minutes going through brainstorming. You can go off of one of the prompts, or you can make a little list for each of them. So before you encounter William Stafford's poem and his particular experience and memory, I want you sort of unadulterated, pure, just going into your own memory and your own mind. I want you to jot some ideas down that you then might return to later after you see what he does with his experience, to come back to one of these experiences and see if you might want to write about one of them. So go ahead and just look at the screen. I'm going to read through them, and then you're going to brainstorm. So what is a time when you had an encounter with nature? Maybe it was in the forest. Maybe it was when you were camping or on a hike. Maybe the natural world came to meet you when you were not expecting it, and you had an encounter with perhaps an animal, or a sunset or sunrise, or maybe it was rolling down that window in your car and the breeze was coming in and you could smell the world outside. Maybe it was even an experience where you weren't physically in nature, but you were on a porch or looking out a window and encountering nature. The best example would be if there was some sort of a story to what happened. And so try to think of something that might be striking up in your memory. Another prompt is to think about a time that you traveled through darkness. The poem we're going to read is called Traveling Through the Dark. That can be very literal, a time where you were walking or driving through actual physical darkness. Or another thing that it might mean is that you're going through a dark time. And so if you want to just kind of think about a time when you were traveling through the dark, maybe go into one abstract example and one more concrete example. But can you think of a time, and you don't have to come up with everything right now related to that, but just jot some notes down for yourself. There is a line in the poem that we're going to be reading that says, "I thought hard for us all." And how relevant is that right now? We have a lot of time as we are socially distancing ourselves and self isolating, and spending a little bit more time with ourselves, possibly more time with the people that we live with, which can be very stressful or very peaceful and wonderful. But it's a time where we're thinking hard about our lives, about what's going to happen to us all. I hope that none of you are experiencing stress or anxiety over that, but that have come possibly to a place of calm and sort of settling into a routine, and trying to do our part. But there have been other times in your life as well where you have thought hard for yourself, for your family, and maybe thought hard for us all as a human race, as all of us, the whole world living on this planet. And this is one of the most beautiful and amazing things about poetry is that it causes us to sit still for a moment, to process, and to think. So, what's a time where something was going on in your life where you kind of pressed that proverbial pause button and you thought hard for us all? Can you think of a couple examples of that and then what came to you? And then the final prompt is a time where you faced a choice. Maybe it was unexpected, maybe you had a lot of time to anticipate it, but you made a decision. Maybe jot down a couple of things that come to your mind when you think about times where you have made choices. Okay, I'm going to ask you to press pause, brainstorm off of one of these prompts or all of them, and just get some things down in your journal that you can go off of. All right, if we are back, I just wanted to quickly show you this story arc, and I want you to think about the parts of a story because when you write your own poem, I want you to try to create what we call a narrative arc. And that's where there might be some exposition at the beginning where you're kind of setting the scene and giving some description. That juncture where it goes from a flat line to the rising action, that pivot point, is called the inciting incident. Something happens, something out of the norm, something that is a disruption or an interruption, but something sparks the beginning of a story. And then we move into what's called rising action. The climactic moment of a story is where either the character gets what he wants or what she wants or doesn't, where everything kind of comes to a head. It can be a high point of action, or it could be that the character is making a choice. And then we have some falling action leading into what we refer to as denouement, which is the final outcome of that story. So this is the idea of story arc. It's something that we can use in our poetry. It's something that when later we're writing fiction, we're going to come back to. So I just wanted to show this kind of story arc to you. And then I'm going to move us right into the poem itself. So again, I'm going to ask you to pause after the poem and after I talk for a moment and do a little bit of reflecting off of these questions. So these are the things that if we were together in the classroom, we would be out in the hallway and you'd be meeting with multiple different partners talking through each of these different questions. But I'm going to read them all to you. We're going to listen to the poem and then you're going to pause and you are going to interact with the poem. I have also linked a copy of the text of the poem itself in Google Classroom for you so that you can look through it and see the physical layout of the poem, which is what we refer to as form. Where are the line breaks? Where are the stanza breaks? When we talk about fiction, we talk about paragraphs and sentences. When we talk about poetry, we look at lines and stanzas. And so I want you to be able to physically see it because when you write a poem tonight, I want you to create stanzas and I want you to have line breaks that are intentional because people apprehend poetry visually. And so you need to be able to think about the form of the poem. All right, here are the things. I want you to begin with just that pure reaction. We're not analyzing. We're not trying to figure out what it means. We just want to take the poem in and let ourselves have that sort of whole person reaction. Thinking about it, feeling it, having an emotional reaction, physically visualizing it, letting that sort of mental movie play. That's the first thing that I want you to do. Next, and in fact, reading the poem again is a great idea at that point where you can go through and really look at the imagery. The most important aspect of writing strong poetry can be boiled down to one primary lesson, and that is the power of imagery. We'll talk more about that later, but notice the beautiful and vivid, but very simple, very easy to imagine imagery that William Stafford uses in this poem. All right, then another aspect that I want you to think about is the abstract versus the concrete. If a poem is completely abstract, it's just going to read like fluff and it's going to just not be something that we can kind of grab onto. But if a poet can give us something concrete, some form of imagery, in this case, some narrative, and we can kind of enter into the world of the poem and the story of the poem, see something and feel something and imagine touching something and hearing something, then those concrete aspects of the poem kind of open us up to receive some abstractions as well. well. And there are a couple parts in this poem that are pretty abstract. The end becomes abstract. And there's some other lines that I think you're going to find to be rather abstract. So kind of notice the not the balance, but the parts of the poem that are abstract and that are actually concrete. Okay, and then finally, reading as a writer, I want you to think about what you can particularly learn from William Stafford, from him showing you that this is what poetry can be, that you can write a poem about literally anything. In this case, a dead deer that he finds on the side of the road. Any experience, anything that happens to you can be translated into poetry. And that's one of the lessons of this poem. But what else can you learn from him about imagery, about form, about drawing a reader in, about making a connection, about perhaps trusting your reader to derive meaning without having to spell out exactly what it is. And so I hope you enjoy the poem. I'm going to play a recording of it right now. And then when that ends, I would like you to press pause and go and visually look at the poem and think through these questions that I have for you here. Here we go.
Traveling Through the Dark by William Stafford. Traveling through the dark, I found a deer dead on the edge of the Wilson River Road. It is usually best to roll them into the canyon. The road is narrow. To swerve might make more dead. By glow of the taillight, I stumbled back of the car and stood by the heap, a doe, a recent killing. She had stiffened already, almost cold. I dragged her off. She was large in the belly. My fingers touching her side brought me the reason. Her side was warm. Her fawn lay there waiting, alive, still, never to be born. Beside that mountain road, I hesitated. The car aimed ahead its lowered parking lights. Under the hood purred the steady engine. I stood in the glare of the warm exhaust turning red. Around our group, I could hear the wilderness listen. I thought hard for us all, my only swerving, then pushed her over the edge into the river.
All right, thank you. I usually love to read that poem aloud, but I thought it might be nice for you to hear another voice since I'm doing all of this talking. There's two things that I want to share with you, and I hope you come back to them after you have done the looking at the poem and gone through these questions. So I'm going to pause here for a second so you can do that. Okay, now coming back, here's a thought for you. This is a part of the everyday life of this particular man. What's a part of your everyday life? This is not about writing narrative poetry that William Stafford would write. This is about seeing how every life has something within it that can turn into poetry, and there's nothing that's too small. The other thing I want you to think about is, what is that poem about? It can be about so many things. It can be about the cycle of life and death. It can be about our relationship to the natural world. It can be about choices. It can be about all sorts of things. And I wish we could have a large group discussion about it right now. But I want you to think about it yourself. And hopefully there's something powerful that's embedded in there that touches you. Okay, we're almost done. There are characters in this particular poem. It happens to be a very limited number of characters, but there are characters. There's a plot, a beginning, a middle, and an end. I could say this happens, and then that happens, and then this happens. That's what a plot is. It takes place in a very particular setting. As you're writing your own poem, thinking about setting, please try to be as particular as possible. Notice how he says the Wilson River Road. That's very specific. We know that there's a car there. We know that the headlights are on and that the exhaust is billowing up into them. That's such a easily visualizable image. When you are writing your own story, what are the details that you remember that stand out to you? You can't include every detail. So you want to particularize and pick the specific details that are going to be most able to create the mood that you want to create and to convey the meaning of your story. And then theme answers the question, what is this poem about? I'm going to be honest with you, when I'm writing poetry, I don't always know what I'm writing about. I don't always know what the story is going to be about. But then as I come back and I revise and I share it with my workshop group and get some feedback from them, eventually you're going to start to realize what your poem is about. And it doesn't have to be about one thing, it can be about many things. But these are all the elements of story, and they can be brought into poetry. All right, so here it is. This is your assignment. And this is going to be actually the first poem that you are going to have workshopped. You don't know all of what that means yet, but basically, in a nutshell, you're going to share your poem with your group. They're going to give you feedback on it. You're going to have a discussion of it. This is totally beyond the idea of like peer editing. So if you've had some experiences with that, let's just leave that aside for now. We'll dig into what workshop is later. But this is the first sort of formal poem that you're going to be writing. And what it is it's a diving board exercise. What does that mean? What that means is that we just read a poem. We're not going to imitate it per se. We're not going to follow, every single detail along with William Stafford, but we're going to think of his poem as being like a diving board. We're going to jump around on it for a minute, and then we're going to launch into our own writing of a poem that has a narrative to it. So here are some of the things that are required within this first poem. And I'd like you to think of trying to make it around the same length as William Stafford's poem as a minimum. But sometimes people get really into writing this particular narrative poem and becomes a longer poem. Totally fine. He has his stanzas arranged in sets of 4 lines, and then there's a couplet at the end. You can make your stanza breaks however you want to, but your poem needs to tell a story. And if you can go back to that brainstorming that you did earlier, maybe you've already thought of the story that you want to tell for this particular poem. All right, the other thing, and this is sort of our objective in this particular poem, is really focusing on sensory imagery. And I don't want just visual imagery. I want you to bring in some of the other senses and really try to create a mood in the poem by particularly choosing which imagery to include. All right, the other thing is I want you to think about that idea of story arc and try to create some momentum towards some sort of a climax in the poem. And that's then going to allow you to set up for a little bit of falling action and denouement, which is that final outcome. And if you notice in William Stafford's poem, the most abstract part comes at the end because he sort of earned the right to be a little bit more abstract. And I want you to do that too. So if there's some more sort of philosophical or idea-oriented things that you'd like to put in your poem, would you really save that until the ending? And that'll be how you conclude your poem. All right, thank you very much for listening. I know this is a very unusual format, but I hope it worked for you. And man, get your journal out, or if you prefer to work on your computer right now, and go dig in. And if the first attempt doesn't work out, try another one. And just start experimenting with narrative poetry writing and see what you can come up with. And one last thing, if you're tempted to write a rhyming poem right now because you think that all poetry has to rhyme, I'm going to put a challenge out to you. Our diving board for this particular assignment did not have any rhyme in it. And I really think that you should try writing a poem without any rhyme for this particular assignment. All right, have fun, writers. I cannot wait to see what you write.